everyone, welcome to The Seven Eighths, a podcast to share stories on failures and rejections. There may not be any fairy tale endings in this podcast. My guests aren't past the mountain of struggle. In fact, some of them might still be in it. I hope this podcast serves as a forum for friends and acquaintances to exchange tales of defeat that make the 7/8ths part of our lives. You know, like the part of the iceberg that you can see. By sharing these stories, I hope we can all normalize failures and hence win over that fear of defeat. Because failing is just a part of living. I hope you will relate. Do leave me a note of feedback, and critique is welcome as well. You can find me on Twitter @FamNectar. Now, on to our episode. Welcome to episode 14 of The 7/8ths. For this episode, I had the luck of sitting down with the Corey Quinn for a conversation. For the few of us that don't know him, Corey is the chief cloud economist at the Doug Bill Group, where he specializes in helping companies improve their AWS bills by making them smaller and less horrifying. He also hosts the Screaming in the Cloud and AWS Morning Brief podcasts, as well as curates Last Week in AWS, a weekly newsletter summarizing the latest in AWS news, blogs, and tools, which is sprinkled with snark and thoughtful analysis in equal measures. Recently, the New York Times feature on Corey called him a part tech analyst, part internet troll, and part watchdog. The article highlighted Corey's success in helping his clients manage cloud infrastructure spend and how Corey got the attention of execs at AWS and Google themselves. But this podcast episode isn't about what the media writes. This episode is about Corey's journey, the string of failures that he went through, his struggles, and how he retells his own story to himself. You will hear a Corey that you don't get to on Twitter, LinkedIn, or any other social media. Let's sit down and just listen in. How are you, Corey?
Not dead yet. Thank you for asking.
Are you usually doing things that might put you in that peril?
Well, when you mouth off to Amazon for a living, I mean, they're $1.5 trillion in terms of market cap now. So I'm always consciously aware of exactly how little of that money it would take to have me killed. And I tend to view every day as if it were sort of my last. I tend to avoid buying green bananas on the theory that I might not live to see them ripen.
I created the 7/8ths because I wanted to talk about failures. I wanted to talk about struggles. I wanted to talk about rejections. And I wanted to open up and acknowledge that all of us go through this life journey. With you, as soon as I pinged you on Twitter and said, hey, would you be open to talking about this? You immediately responded, and I want to thank you for that.
Well, the problem I had is when I started out going to tech conferences right around, I want to say 2010 or so, it became pretty clear that there was a recurring theme. Everyone would get on stage and talk in various forms about how awesome they were, how smart they were, all of the terrific things that happened to them because they were just so smart and just so clever. They talked about things like deployments and projects that went flawlessly. And I'm looking at what they're saying, and I turn to someone next to me and say, wow, I wish I could work on a project that went that well. And the person next to me says, yeah, so do I. And it turned out they worked at the same company the speaker did, because it's all people telling their successes and never their failures. And I get why you want to serve as an inspiration to some extent, but let's be realistic here. None of us emerge through life unscathed. We are the product of what happens to us, good and bad. And I think that we tend to mostly try and sweep the failure portion of it under the rug.
Yeah, true. But that's where all of our lessons are, right? So when I reached out to you, you talked about 3 big failures in your life as we were sketching the theme for this podcast. And it kind of surprised me because when I see you now as such in fact, there was just a New York Times article on you. So congratulations. I saw that.
Thank you. It's still surreal that I find that what I do is interesting enough that a actual serious publication cares enough about what I'm doing to talk to me. It continues to elude me, but smile, nod. And when people say you're doing something well, The only correct response I've learned is thank you. If you're like, oh, I'm not that interesting, what you're fundamentally doing is insulting their choice. So smile, nod, be gracious, and in my case, change the subject as soon as possible.
But when we talked, you talked about failing at college. That actually surprised me because now I see you being so well respected in various social media platforms, as well as your work speaking for itself. Talk to me about what happened.
I was a challenged student. It turns out that homework wasn't interesting to me, and I can reason well enough to a certain point to be able to answer things on the fly or remember things that I've read. And there's a point in school you hit where, at least for me, there was a wall where you can no longer solve things from a first principles perspective. Instead, you have to have done the work, and I suck at the preparation piece because most of my life tends to be improv. And my grades started struggling. I had challenges with authority. I wound up going to public high school for the first 2 years and then repeating my sophomore year at a boarding school. At the end of the first year in boarding school, their position was, yeah, we've thought about this, and this is an expensive New England boarding school, and we love the tens of thousands of dollars a year we charge in tuition. But you know what we like more? Not having you here. Please don't come back. And okay, I went to a second boarding school for one semester and then was tossed out because, let's just call it teenage hijinks. My sense of humor wasn't quite as evolved. So at that point, I shrugged, okay, took a homeschooling organization's final test series and graduated with a homeschooling diploma, which was fascinating.
So how did it feel getting almost kicked out of private boarding school?
Oh, no, almost about it. I was kicked out twice. That's the best part. It definitely causes a certain element of self-reflection. At that point, I wasn't really equipped with the tools that it was going to take to delve into that in any meaningful way. I mean, you can see people react to these things in certain ways because, and we'll get to this too, but I was also fired from a bunch of jobs as well. And yeah, that first school, they didn't want me to come back. Yeah, why? Because they suck. The second school didn't want me to come back. Oh, that's because they suck too. Oh, the last 4 bosses who fired me, yeah, they all suck. You know, there's only really one consistent point between all of these stories, and it's not the other person. It's a dawning, creeping awareness of, oh God, maybe I'm the one who sucks. In some respects, I did. But I also don't believe that failing out of school in an academic sense, as I did in college, or getting booted out on your ear from boarding school necessarily means you're a failure in all facets.
How did you deal with that, though? What did you tell yourself? I mean, the first time, the second time, and then literally struggling to finish high school.
I didn't think about it much. I just kept moving on. After I wound up getting the homeschooling diploma and effectively repeating my sophomore year and never having a senior year, I got into the University of Maine purely on the strength of my SAT scores. Because standardized tests and I get along super well, me doing homework is not a thing that happens. I went to the University of Maine, double majored in computer science and philosophy, and then failed out. Turns out when you don't show up for class and don't take all the tests and wind up with a failing grade, that failure is the technical definition in academia, or so I'm told. Again, as covered, I am not much of an academic, but that was a part that did stick with me. Years later, I found out as well that the homeschooling organization I got a diploma from was not accredited, which means that on paper, I have an 8th grade education.
Wait.
Oh, yeah.
You already used fail twice in that sentence. So before we go any further, what were your coping mechanisms? Did you feel the need to cope? Was there a fear of failure?
No, because this is the problem I think that a lot of us have. We believe there's one path that our life is going to take us down, that we're somehow going to hit the certain points. I'm going to graduate college with this degree. I'm going to apply to that specific company or one just like it and get the following type of role. And over the next 4 years, I will go from this role and get promoted, yada, yada, yada. And when something derails that, we view, oh no, my life is ruined. No, it isn't. Life is what happens to us instead of what we plan. So from my perspective, it was just okay, well, that path's not going to happen. Okay. I think it's important to have a 5-year or a 10-year plan or a goal with the implicit understanding that you're almost certainly not going to hit that, but it gives you a direction and keeps you moving. And as you start moving in that direction, you find other things that align better with what you want to do, or you discover the goal you're chasing isn't really something that you want. People's past don't define them. It's what they do and who they are. It's like if you go digging far enough, everyone has skeletons in their closet. I think what makes me a bit of a special case is I don't shy away from mine and sit here losing sleep that people are going to discover them. You want to go digging and find some dirt? Cool. Ask me. I'm very much an open book in these stories.
So you did not have a fear of failure.
No, I had an expectation of failure. I'm just waiting for the whole house of cards to come crashing down at any moment. So then all my surprises become pleasant ones.
That is funny. So you almost expected to fail.
That's a fair assessment, yeah. In fact, I still do. I'm still waiting for someone to realize, hey, he's a giant fraud. And yep, okay, cool, you caught me. And at some point along the way, I did realize that this was no longer an accurate self-perception. But it's hard to change your own self-assessment.
How did you land up in jobs when you did fail out of college and you realized that your homeschool degree was no longer valid?
Well, in my defense, first, I didn't lie about things. I didn't realize I didn't have an accredited high school diploma until near the end of my 20s, by which point I was already on an established track. But the honest answer is the basis of what I do and the things that I did, I gravitated naturally toward fields that did not have a credential requirement. I was not out there practicing law or deciding, you know what, I want to be an amateur anesthesiologist. Yeah, it just wasn't a thing. So it was initially, I started in my 20s working a bunch of crap jobs, which think in terms of help desk support or a lot of sales jobs as well. Not that sales is a crap job, but some of these companies, not the best places in the world. And it turns out that sales is a great example. Like, what credentials do you have? No one cares. The only number that really matters in any sense to the world of sales is, well, are you hitting quota or not? You're only as good as last month's sales. And that lent itself to a few things that aligned with my worldview, but it's also a constant race in some respects, especially at some of those, as mentioned, not great companies.
So talk to me about what happened in your journey with a full-time job.
There were a lot of those, and it really depends at what era we're talking about. Because, all right, great. If you don't have a credential, you need to have something that speaks to your ability to do a job. Any job you ever apply for is only in an interview is only ever going to ask you 3 questions, but they're going to mix and match them and frame them different ways. Can you do the job? Will you do the job? And can we stand working with you? The failure for most of mine was, and the last one, but generally people realized, oh, once I start working with Corey for a long time, he's a jerk. Yeah, in some ways I was in that era. I am now, but in different, more constructive ways. And that was an evolution in my understanding of myself. But it was also tied to this idea that you show up, you do a job, you make the money, and then life repeats. And I had a bunch of people advising me that I just need to keep my head down, go find some job that I don't love, but it'll be good enough. Sure, I spend 40 hours of my week working at that job, but then the rest of my time is my own, and then I can live my life. And that sounded awful. It still does, if I'm being perfectly honest. 40 hours a week for your entire career. That's a ridiculous amount of time.
So how did you then move from one job to another? I mean, weren't you worried about how people would perceive you from the outside, seeing you job hop, seeing you have 1 year of experience, but in 5 or 6 different jobs, as opposed to 6 years of experience at one job?
Until I started this company, I never stayed at a job longer than 2 years. For a long time, I wound up wrapping up a lot of those early jobs under the auspices of a consulting practice, which there was a fair bit of consulting in there along the way. Remember, resumes are not exhaustive lists of everything you've done professionally. It's a highlight reel. And if I'm at some place for 3 months and then get booted out, well, that doesn't go on my resume. It was a very different approach. And I want to be very clear here. I'm not suggesting people should lie on their resume, but I'm not also suggesting that there is no benefit to being overly candid about everything that you have done in your career. What people lose sight of is that a resume is not an exhaustive list of your history. It's a sales document.
That's a smart way to put it. So talk to me about how you failed yourself through multiple jobs and ended up where you are right now.
At some point, one of the skills that I took a particular shine to, which is fortunate given everything else I've said so far, is the ability to pass a job interview. At the time, I viewed it as pass fail. These days, I view that as a very naive approach. Interviews are two-way streets, full stop. You need to figure out if you're a good fit for the company, just as they need to figure out if you're a good fit for them. That said, at this stage of my life, I've just been fired, rent is due in 4 weeks, and I don't have it. Time to hustle. So there's a certain role at that point where, what's my ideal job? One that keeps a roof over my head. It's not a fun way to live. Let me be very clear on that.
It sounds daunting to me just to hear it.
Oh, it was daunting at the time. And again, it was touch and go at times. There were good times. There were bad times. It was a lot of interesting experiences tied together in a bunch of different ways. It felt almost like every year of experience I had doing stuff like this, it manifested as 3 years, just because of the sheer variety of companies I saw, people I talked to, experiences I had. And that was a very weird thing. I mean, I'd failed out of the University of Maine, so I had a free place to stay with my uncle for 6 weeks in Southern California. Figured I'd spend a summer in California and then move back to Maine. I never went back to Maine. I also, for the record, am not still living on my uncle's couch.
But going back to hustling to make sure that you have a roof above your head, and given that you had already prepared yourself mentally to fail, it almost feels like those two forces are opposing each other, right? So how do you build the confidence to go find and land the next job when you know that you're already going to fail?
Realistic self-assessment is how. I was not deluding myself into thinking that the job I need to find in a hurry that starts immediately is going to be my quote unquote forever job.
But even building up the confidence to land the job when you know that you're going to fail, how did you build that confidence up?
I don't think confidence was a requirement there. I think that it was a realistic assessment that I was good at job interviewing, and at least for a time, I could trick people into thinking that I would be a good employee. And this was also before I developed the technical skills that really started to transform my career in my mid-20s. This was a bunch of small-time job to small-time job. I did a lot of different things. I was a technical recruiter. I was a telemarketer. I worked in marketing. I worked in sales. And those skills are all speaking to different aspects of my personality. The real dark one that I almost never admit is I did spend a brief stint as a Windows systems administrator.
So how did you go from there to having a New York Times article written about you?
You know, I'm still not entirely clear on that one myself. The real breakthrough for me was I finally decided that my last job was as a technical recruiter. And I kept placing people into roles where they were making significantly more money than I was. But in my conversations with these people, it was pretty clear to me that, I could do this job better than they can, and they're making way more money than I am. And that meant that one of two things were true. Either I was completely mistaken on that assessment, in which case I sounded like an arrogant ass and I should shut up, or I was right and I was an idiot for staying.
Mm-hmm. How did you validate that hypothesis?
My last candidate I placed was me. I took a job and let's see what happens. It's a 50% raise. Cool. It was at a university of all things. They wanted a network administrator to focus on Linux. Their technical interviewer was out sick that day, and they liked the confidence of my answers. I'm not kidding. So I basically bluffed my way through the interview, which distilled down to rate yourself from 1 to 10 on the following technologies. And, I'll give myself a 7 or an 8 on most of these because I've read them in a book once. I spent the next 3 months of that gig working effectively 16-hour days of cramming and learning the things I need to do, because there is a skill that I do legitimately have is I learn quickly. I assimilate information and I retain it. And by the end of that 3-month sprint, I realized that I sort of had overshot. I was effectively the Linux expert in the university's department. And the fact that I'd done that in 3 months was not because I was amazing. It was because they didn't have a deep bench of technical skill in that direction. And it worked. I was making more money than I ever made before in my life in working for a university, which is not a thing people say very often unless they're, a football coach. So After a year of that, some company reached out and asked if I'd be interested in working there. And it's like, I don't think so. I mean, I kind of like, I like what I'm doing now. I don't feel like I'm going to get fired all the time. And there's job security. Why should I change roles? And the answer was, we'll pay you 50% more. And oh, that's why. See ya, university. And then it started basically clawing my way up on the sysadmin / DevOps / SRE treadmill for, well, that was in 2007 that I left the university, and we're now in 2021. So yeah, the last 14 years.
You just touched on something which I want to double click and see if we can explore together a little bit more. You use these words, not have the feeling that I'm going to get fired every day. Is that how you were feeling in your jobs?
On some level, I have never escaped that feeling. Every time that my boss would send me a Slack message at my last real job of, hey, can we talk? I would get that sinking feeling of, oh, crap. Every time that an unscheduled meeting showed up on my calendar with my boss for a one-on-one, oh, dear. Because usually it doesn't happen. But once in a while, you show up to that meeting, there's someone from HR that you don't recognize who has a manila envelope and they don't offer you coffee. When they don't offer you coffee, it's not a good meeting. And surprise, you're on the job market again. It happened a lot less once I entered tech, both because it's a different ecosystem, as well as, let me give myself a little bit of credit here, I got better at playing the game. And the game, of course, is corporate life. It turns out that being funny and snarky and hilarious is still possible without being a raging asshole to the people you work with.
Did you get feedback in these jobs before you got fired?
Sometimes. Sometimes it was a complete surprise. I still maintain that if you get fired and it is not for cause, namely something you have done that is a blatant violation of the employment agreement, think things like embezzlement or fraud. And if you are fired and that is not and that comes as a surprise, your manager has failed or you are oblivious. And that bar for being oblivious is high. I mean, at this point, to be very clear, I run my own company. I have 11 people working here now. I believe there's more than ever. People need to know where they stand. And when you are supervising people, the responsibility falls on you to impedance match with the person you're speaking to. They should always know where they stand. One of my last bosses before I did this had this obnoxious habit of only speaking in metaphor. And I never knew where I stood until one day, surprise, guess where I'm not working anymore. And that sort of snapped. And I said a minute ago that I didn't really ever escape this. And I haven't. My business partner and I will send messages to one another from time to time where it's, oh, hey, can we talk? And the response is, oh, God, what's wrong? And there's that still creeping fear of, oh, God, I'm about to get fired, which doesn't even make sense. We each own half of the company. We can't fire each other. We have no one client that is a more than 20% of revenue is the actual official term for insurance purposes. In practicality, it's far less. There is no person that can fire us globally. It does not happen that way. And we still get that stabbing fear. And it's not just me, he does too. And that's when I realized maybe either I'm not as broken as I thought I was, and this is more normal, or there are an awful lot more people like me out there than I thought.
There is definitely an awful lot more people like you out there than you think.
And that's why I'm loud about this. This is why I want to have these conversations, because I'm not suggesting that I should be anything resembling a role model or something that people should attempt to pattern their trajectory on. But if nothing else, I would love to serve as a horrible warning to others, as well as a sense that it's going to be okay. You get to reinvent yourself every day of your life if you want to. So what's stopping you?
Yeah. Did you have a network? Did you have a group of people that you could reach out to, lean on?
Not like I do today, but yes, and everyone does. Because here's the secret of people who are highly successful and make giant piles of money. And I say this as something I learned when no one would have called me successful, and money was very much a thing that only other people had. And that is if you take a look at the most successful people in the world, in business, in basically any other aspect, the thing that they all have in common, regardless of their field, is they do favors for other people without any expectation of being repaid, without any jealous guarding of favors as if they're things they need to dole out. They help people eagerly and given the slightest provocation. I decided early on that was one way I would strive to live my life. Because let's be very serious here. An awful lot of people have done me favors that I will never be able to repay. So all I can do is pay that forward. When people reach out asking me for help or an introduction to something, I love that moment. I love being able to help people because it's a tiny, small nothing for me, but it has the potential to change the course of someone's life. I know that because it happened for me multiple times. Everyone knows someone. Everyone wants to help. Everyone is able to make a connection to someone else that has the potential of being an impactful experience and helps both people that they're introducing. Yeah, if you can wrap your head around that, the world's your oyster on some level. I also want to be very clear here as well. I am a cishet white guy who works in tech. I am drowning in privilege over here. And there is feedback that I've gotten before that it doesn't work this way for everyone. Now, I want to be very clear. The way that I do things, I don't think it works for anyone. I'm still stunned it works for me. But yeah, there are still people willing to do favors. There are still people willing to help. And I think that is a universal human experience. I'm very passionate about this belief. If you're listening to this and you know that I know someone who you would love to meet or want to ask me for a thought on something you're debating doing or a leap you're planning on taking, please reach out. Again, I owe people debts I can never repay. This is how I pay it forward. Let me help you, please.
Yeah, that's really sweet of you, Corey. And what is interesting in this conversation for me is, I'm going to use your words. You are a privileged white male in tech.
Extremely so.
And it was interesting to know that even you go through failures, even you go through that sinking feeling whenever you get a Slack from your manager saying, hey, can we have a chat? And it's either the fear of failure or it is the fear of your expectations becoming a reality. It was surprising to hear that because I just assumed there may be small setbacks that you will go through, but nothing that will completely derail you. Clearly, I was wrong.
The problem too is that you keep going back to this idea in my early 20s of keep getting fired, crestfallen, massive setback and disappointment. There was no other option though from where I sat. What was I going to do? Give up, start selling all my possessions and go and decide that, well, now it's time to move back in with my parents half a continent away, or effectively just give up and what? Sit around and play video games? There wasn't really another option from the way that I viewed the world. And I was very fortunate. I understand in hindsight that I should not have had the string of breakthroughs that I did. I should have wound up in that position. And even the fact that my failure mode was not living on the street, but rather moving back in with my parents is an incredible expression of privilege. And I am profoundly aware of that.
That is true. That is true.
But it never got to that point because it felt to me at the time, and this is, you want to talk privilege, it felt to me like, well, do I live on the street or do I move back in with my parents if this whole thing doesn't come through? And the fact that I even had to consider that as if one was just as bad as the other is telling. It's such a privileged worldview.
That is so true. That is so true, especially living in the Bay Area and working in tech. We all have a view of failure that is probably a little far from the realities of the rest of the world. We all have, I want to say, a privileged view of failures. Just hearing you say that and articulate it in the way you did is actually very eye-opening.
And again, I run a company now. There is the risk of failure. The thing that keeps me awake at night, the haunting fear, because we are not venture-backed, we are bootstrapped, or we fund ourselves with this ancient business model called revenue and profitability. We make more money than we cost to run the place. But the haunting fear that I have now is this company fails, that the leads stop coming in, people stop engaging us on client projects. My media things that I do with my newsletter and podcasts suddenly are no longer interesting to sponsors. And I have to basically lay everyone off, because when people work for you, what they're fundamentally saying is that for the next stage of their career, they are basically putting their livelihood in your hands. And that's a hell of a responsibility. And that is the fear that keeps me up at night, because I've got to level with you. I don't have professional risk anymore in any meaningful sense. You want to talk ridiculous levels of insane privilege here. If the Duckbill Group collapses and I shut down my last week in AWS newsletter and I have to go get a real job somewhere, I am going to be making 6 or 7 figures at some random tech company, and it's a failure because my company didn't work, and now I'm an employee again, and I'm just not happy on some level. Now, that's not an ideal outcome for me, but the fact that that is considered a failure, what kind of a jackass am I? There really is the Maslow's hierarchy of needs here. I have no realistic risk of failure in my life in that sense anymore. Instead, I have the risk of letting down people who have basically placed very large bets with their careers and livelihood on me. And that is a risk. And I don't care how you slice that.
Yeah, and you're knocking some sense into my perception, at least, of failures by just laying it out and structuring it in the way that you did. I want to talk a little bit about what I can call as your personal failures.
Oh, there are many of my personal failures and personal failings. In fact, my personality is basically one giant failure case study, but please, fire away.
What are the personal failures then that you would be open to sharing?
I spent my 20s in crippling credit card debt.
Oh, I did not see that coming.
Nope. It's one of those things that if you talk about failing out of school or getting fired from a job or being in crippling debt, what makes those 3 stories interesting to me, because they're all different forms of failure. Almost everyone I talk to can identify with at least one of them. And they tell me that whenever I bring these up, but no one talks about them. So when it happens to you, you think that you're a fuck up, and you're not. That's why I'm talking about this. I always had terrible financial habits in a variety of ways. And some of that is inborn. People are often inclined to be either the spender mentality or the saver mentality. And I didn't have a lot of great role models. I saw people growing up who were of the type, if you give them there's some people that if you give them $1, they're going to go ahead and put 15% of that away for retirement, 10% away for savings or a rainy day. They're going to budget 40 cents of that to pay their bills and rent and whatnot. Okay, great. There are other people, and this is the one I was, where you give them $1, they'll spend 3. And you can't out-earn that mentality. That's why you see things like lottery winners or celebrities who have hit it big file bankruptcy so often.
Yeah.
Financial discipline's hard. And it took me a long time to dig my way out of that. To give you rough numbers, because fuck it. Talking about numbers helps. I was 80 grand in the hole. And that was about what I was making a year when I'd started out in my first corporate Linux admin gig. So cool. Your annual salary is what you owe in credit card debt. I mean, there are people with student debt loads that aren't that high. I mean, I guess you could say that I was jealous of people who had degrees, and I thought that I went for the wrong part. Instead of getting the degree, I just went with the debt portion instead. And again, there's no great story here. It isn't that I financed a business that tanked or anything like that. It wasn't this big investment that went off poorly. Hell no. I wound up swiping the card for everything for things I couldn't afford. There's no moral here. There's no, but I'm just a misunderstood genius. No, I was an idiot with terrible financial habits. Let's not kid ourselves.
How did you break that habit?
You realize at some point that there has to be an awakening, and it has to come internally, and it has to come from conversations. Right around the time I got married, in my case, where I realized I was not going to burn through everything that we brought in. I was not going to effectively ask my wife to go down that direction. And I'm not suggesting that it was just like, well, I decided not to be in debt anymore. No, good God, no. And again, my wife is a corporate attorney. We are 2 high earning people here. So this is not one of those we scrimped and we saved and we clawed our way out of it stories. But it was one of those, it is very clear that if you spend more than you earn, it is incredibly hard to have a good life in the society we live in. So that has to change, or everything else I'm trying to do is not going to happen. It was a real self-reckoning.
Did that hurt you, given that, you already had a perception that you were going to fail at your next gig? And on top of that, recognizing that you have a crippling credit card debt and that you had to take action to close that gap in your earning versus spending.
It was worse than that, because remember, when you're in burning debt and you have no money, no savings to speak of, and you're basically paycheck to paycheck, every career decision you make in that situation biases toward what pays the most. And that is a terrible way to view what you should do next in your career in the abstract, because Yeah, this company will pay you $120,000 a year and you'd be happy there, versus this company will pay you $150,000 a year and they make landmines, is one of those things where at that stage of my life, bias for the money and hell with it. Today, I have a very different perspective.
Let's talk about your ADHD next.
Sure. I've only started talking about this publicly recently, but again, if I can be a good reference point for people, terrific. I want to be very clear as well that this is my experience I'm talking about. This is not mental health advice. For God's sake, see a mental health professional if this resonates and you think that this is something that may apply to you. If they don't believe you or they dismiss your concerns out of hand, they're crap. Find another. This is, again, something that I have super easy as a white guy. Not everyone is in my privileged position. It is not you, it's them. Keep looking.
Yeah. So let's talk about you struggling with your ADHD. Did you recognize the symptoms early on?
I was diagnosed formally when I was 5 years old. Again, when you're a white guy of relatively affluent parents, yeah, it turns out that you get a lot of things done easily for you. I started on Ritalin when I was 5 years old. When I was 17, I finally stopped taking it and decided to white knuckle my way through the next decade. Don't do that. Sorry, if you're me, don't do that. I'm not giving advice on other people's brain chemistry here.
Yeah, yeah. And did that affect, again, your perception of yourself?
Being ADHD is a part and parcel of who I am. It is how my brain works. It's very difficult for me to differentiate the specific disorder, which is a spectrum disorder, from who I am and how I operate. The things that make me amazing are the things that make me suck. And honestly, I don't know which aspects of what I have in some cases are ADHD portion or just the weird combination of who and what I am.
So how did you get through the 10 years without medical support?
It's how your brain works. I'm more distractible at that point. I don't wind up getting things done. I stall on things that need to get done and I don't deliver on them. And I miss deadlines all the time. And it turns out that on some level, a coping mechanism there is getting fired. Because, yeah, it sucks, but a silver lining is all those projects you have on your back burner that you need to get to and haven't gotten to, it's piling up and overwhelming you in that big pile of thing in your email inbox. You're fired, get the hell out of here. It's like, well, shit is your first answer. And the second is, oh my God, all those things I was juggling and worrying about getting to, I don't have to do anymore. Awesome. It's a thin silver lining, but it's there.
Wow. So how are you coping now?
Again, you want to talk extensive expression of privilege? Here we go. Because I have my own company, there are options that are open to me that are not to a lot of other people. A disturbing proportion of what employees at the Duckbill Group are fundamentally doing is building and providing structure that makes up for a number of my shortcomings. And on the one hand, I feel guilt about that. I genuinely do, because they shouldn't have to do that. If I were just better at keeping to a calendar or sticking to a list of things to get done or getting everything across the line when it needs to be, then they'd be able to go do things that are much more rewarding and redeeming. The counter argument is if I spent time doing those things and was good at those, well, the thing that I do that is unique and is my central strange place in the ecosystem / universe that act as the reason this business works, it is better for everyone if I focus on those things and not learning to keep my office tidy.
Fair enough. Were you scared until you discovered your place in the ecosystem? Because it now sounds like you have discovered your place in the ecosystem.
I've got you fooled too. Great. Yeah, I'm still waiting for this whole house of cards to come crashing down. I'm quite serious about that. I don't expect that I'm going to be doing the same thing in 10 years. I'm not looking to get out of it, but I'm not worried about the idea of, well, what if the market changes? Scary thing for me is what if it doesn't? What if in 30 years, companies still need help with their AWS bills because they don't understand them, or AWS marketing is still an impenetrable thicket of misunderstanding? That's the worst outcome because that doesn't help customers. It doesn't help people build things that are meaningful. I don't want to be doing the same thing for the rest of my life ever. And it doesn't matter what that same thing is.
Oh, how noble of you to say that.
Not noble at all, because remember, ADHD, I thrive on novelty. In fact, the consulting piece of our business, I am almost entirely out of most weeks because the first one you do, someone gives you a bill, their AWS bill, it's save me money. Oh dear, how am I going to do this? And you dive into it. It's a fun problem. By the time you do it a third time, okay, it's down to a pattern. By the 8th or 9th, great. Okay, you see odd things here and there, but it's mostly formulaic. And now it's boring. And now too many days are starting to look the same. So if it were up to me, it would have been, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to pivot to something else. And my business partner slapped the stupid out of my mouth and said, no, idiot. And what we did, as it turned out, was we hired a team of cloud economists who are way better at this than I ever was. And it's this deeper story of, I guess, new and shiny for me, what I chase. So the trick is I just wind up building systems and support structures to pick up the shiny pieces behind me. I write a weekly newsletter every week that goes out to 25,000 people and change now, that gathers up the AWS news from the ecosystem and then makes fun of it. The jokes aren't for the audience, they're for me. Because every week it's different. How can I be snarky and funny and make jokes that aren't the same old joke, but not cross a line? Because without that, do you have any idea how boring this field is? It's chasing the novelty for me. You asked how ADHD affects me. That is a key example.
Yeah. Well, this was a wild conversation.
I have a lot of those, as it turns out.
Yeah. I mean, this was a first of mine. I mean, in all the interviews that I've done so far, you're probably different in the sense that you have embraced your failures to a point where you don't call them failures at all. At least it doesn't look like you categorize them as failures.
It's part and parcel of who I am. My choices were, honestly, I either can embrace it like I have, or I can stop fucking up. And let's be honest here, it's easier to change a story than it is to change a reality.
And here is where the beauty of the situation is. You're giving yourself the permission to fail. And I heard that over and over again through our conversation the last hour. And you don't hold failures with that negative connotation whereby it's going to be the end to everything that you've undertaken. It almost looks like you take failures as just another day in the life. And how can you be different given that you have ADHD and that's what you lean towards? How can that be different from the next day, which you almost set up to say, yeah, where am I going to fail today? Fascinating.
Yeah. Again, I have an interview podcast myself. I'm 200 some odd episodes recorded now, and each one is a half-hour discussion of what someone else is doing. It's called Screaming in the Cloud. And people look at that like, well, that's not snarky. How are you not bored with that and moving on? Because every episode I get to talk to someone different about what they're working on, what they're passionate about. That's never boring.
In my case, I want to say thank you for giving me the chance to talk to you about your life journey. Thank you for being so candid about all of the struggles that you've had, and also calling out the fact that you still struggle from a place of privilege. And lastly, thank you for normalizing failing. Because I do think the more and more we share stories of failures and struggles and rejections, the more we would help normalize failures and embrace it, because that's just life. So thank you, Corey. This has been fun.
No, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And that's how the cookie crumbles. Having a conversation with Corey was like finding treasure. Let's start with a few. Corey's reframing of a resume as a sales doc. The sales doc can be used to tell the story that you want to tell with it, instead of it being just a collection of plain experiences. I also realized that everyone, including Corey, has a fear of failure. But rather than letting it stop you, you can turn this fear of failure into an expectation of failure and use that as an opportunity to reinvent yourself. Lastly, Corey helped to remind me that the failures that we are still talking about are failures from a place of privilege. So a regular reality check and remembering to be humble and grateful is a right antidote. Thank you for listening to this episode. Do leave me your thoughts. I am on Twitter @FarmNectar. Until the next conversation. Cheers, guys.